I mean, we're about 22 minutes into this, so I'd like to sort of yank it into the present here and ask you to apologize and explicate and help us understand fantasy, because another essay you wrote much later was about fantasy. And before I get you to talk about that, I want to say why this is on my mind, because my friend John Kessel, one of the postmoderns, and I are editing the Nebula anthology this year. And so we're looking at the stories that were on the ballot for the Nebula this year, and we're picking, you can't pick everything, alas, but we're picking the stories. And one of the things that struck me, because I went back and looked at the first Nebulas, was that the Nebula list of I think it was 66, has hardly any, has one woman on it, and has no fantasy on it. Whereas the book we're going to turn in will probably be half fantasy, and I think the count is roughly equal. Maybe there's one more woman than men. So you wrote an essay about fantasy, the coming of fantasy, and the changes in fantasy, and so I blame you for the fact that science fiction is waning and fantasy is growing.
It had it coming.
Yeah, right. We'll talk about that one, because that's sort of the scene today, or at least it presages the scene today.
Well, I've always liked fantasy. I started out as a fantasist before I learned how to write. Finally learned how to write. By then I was a science fiction writer, but I never lost that deep love of fantasy. And when I started reading fantasy, it was a time when it was very good, and you read E.R. Edison and Mervyn Peake and a few others, and then you were down to Robert E. Howard, and then you were down to Brack the Barbarian, and then you switched your loyalty over to science fiction.
Right.
And then the Tolkien explosion happened, and it became possible for a fantasist to read nothing but fantasy. But for a long time, most of that fantasy was not very good, because if you could write anything that looked like a fantasy novel, you could get it published. And they would probably give you a contract for a trilogy, because they had this huge appetite to feed. And I kept going to the young fantasists, most of the interesting ones of whom were female at that time. I don't know how it is now. And I was saying, why aren't you guys more ambitious? Why aren't you issuing manifestos and insulting each other the way that we do in science fiction? You know,
it's good for you.
It's good for you. It's a sign of literary ferment. And I remember Ellen Kushner gave me this wonderful little rant. She said that there were no schools and there were no groups in science and fantasy, because good fantasy was unschoolable, it was ungroupable, it was unique, it was sui generis. I said, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to go think about that. And I came back a year later, and I said at the same convention, I said, Ellen, so I understand that you're the head of the Manor Punks now.
Right.
And she at least had the sense to blush.
Yeah.
But I decided that I wanted to raise ambition in the field, and which I, coming up through science fiction, identified with a lot of hostility from experience. So I said, okay, last time I didn't mean to raise all this fuss. I wrote that essay in complete innocence. This one, I'm going to make the frogs hop. I'm going to throw a stone right in the middle of their pond. So I wrote another one as extravagant as possible, and I praised very highly and very deeply the writers who really deserved it, writing stuff at the time, Terry Bisson and Greer Gilman and so on. And it came out, and I could answer the phone all I wanted.
Yeah.
They love bombed me. It turned out that fantasy writers are just nicer people.
What was the title?
That was in the tradition,
right.
a journey through the fantasy archipelago.
Right.
There's
a combination of postmoderns and archipelago from Tachyon that probably is.
They might have a few copies in the Tachyon table. The Postmodern Archipelago, it's a chapbook. It's got both the essays. And if they don't, then they lost a chance to make some money.
Yeah, because we just flogged it here, so.
That came, I think, kind of by coincidence. It came just before all the fantasy writers began to get more self-consciously ambitious. Mm-hmm. And to hang out with each other and encourage each other. I think a big thing that happened there, and I covered in the essay, was Greer Gilman wrote Moonwise. And it is the most difficult fantasy novel ever written that was worth reading. There have been more difficult fantasy novels, but they were treff. And hers is fabulous. And when that novel hit, it was a paperback original. When that hit, there were all of a sudden there were all these young fantasists running around, going, grabbing each other, by the collars and saying, "Have you read this? You must read this. It's wonderful. Why can't I do this? Why can't I do this? Why can't I do this?" And of course they could.
Right.
So it was another very exciting time. And if you look at the way Jim did, I had something to do with it. But actually, it's more like I wrote my essay just after Greer really just sparked something. And it just like they reached critical mass. Something was going to be the match to start that fire. And I think it was Greer.
So here we are now today. And